This is JB Bike Parts, and we're going to be showing you how to replace your front fork with one of our modified dual shock forks. To start off with, you're going to get a box similar to this, and inside of it is going to be your dual shock fork. In some cases, you may have a larger speed disc. The first thing we want to do is remove the front brakes and caliper. The next thing we're going to do is use a 17mm wrench to take off the front tire. Next, we're going to take off the back fender. Do note some of the newer Jetsons have a different way to install the front fenders and back fenders. Next, we're going to take off the brake cable. We're going to go ahead and loosen it up, and we'll pull back, and it pulls off. We're going to set the cable aside for now. Next step we're going to do is loosen the folding assembly. Next, you'll loosen the fork and stem retainer using an M6. Then you just slide slowly out. Lift up the handlebar folding assembly. You'll remove the collar ring. Next, you'll do the upper bearing brace retainer. This will loosen up the fork. Remove the top washer also. Be careful not to drop the bearings. So bearing 1, and inside there is bearing number 2. Leave the bottom bearing in. On the original fork, what we're going to do now is remove the lower retaining brace on the fork. And we'll be using a hacksaw to be able to cut off the weld. The tack weld that we'll be cutting is right below the lower bearing race. So we will check. All we're doing is taking off the actual welding, not cutting through the whole device. We're going to alternate sides 180 degrees and hammer both sides with something compatible. And now we have the part that we need to make this happen. Now you'll grab the new fork, put on the lower bearing brace, so we hammer it to go as far down as possible, and then once we have the top part, we can modify.
Once you install the bearings, it's going to crush itself and it's going to self-level itself out. And then once you do that, you're going to tighten it up as much as you can, snug it down, and then back it off maybe an eighth of a turn, a quarter of a turn.
Next, we're going to put the bearing in for the lower bearing. Next, we'll get the upper bearing race and screw it on. Remember that the upper bearing is inside of there already. Use some channel locks to be able to tighten the top upper bearing brace. Check the turning radius. Use the channel locks again.
Back it off a quarter return.
And back it off a quarter return. And that's your preload.
So what we're going to use the washer and install it directly onto the keyway, onto the new fork, line it up, and then this will prevent it from the upper bearing race loosening up the fork. So the next thing to do is to actually reinstall the upper stem of the bike. This is the tapered nut that is utilized to keep keep the fork and the stem together with the bolt in the middle. Stick it back into position, and what you want to do is snug it up a little bit using your 6mm Allen head wrench. Snug it up a little bit. Bring this forward and bring your fork centered, and then you're gonna center the fork and your stem almost straight. This can be adjusted once it's all finalized. Once you do your road test, they can be adjusted later on for fine tuning. So once you have it snug, it's adjusted straight. Use your 6mm Allen wrench, tighten it up. Make sure this is nice and snug. This is very important. Alright, that part is completed. Everything seems to be straight. We can now move on to actually checking, make sure the turning radius from right to left is almost equal. So if you turn it like this, you see this angle here should match going to the right position. And if it's off, you can always just tap it a little bit, and then that lower race that we broke the tack weld on will shift a little bit. And if that's too off, just bump it till you have even turning radius from right to left. So some of the designs on the next generation DualShock forks, what's happening is that the caliper bracket where it hooks onto has been redesigned. Some will use the 108mm disc, which we will be providing with the DualShock, or you can still use the original ones depending on design, but we will determine that before it's shipped out. So now we're going to get your wheel, and then we're going to start removing these Allen head bolts to install the 180mm disc. You'll be using most likely a 4mm Allen socket. You can take off all the Allen head bolts. Now, one thing to remember that these discs have an arrow designating the rotation, the forward rotation of the disc that it has to be in place. You will see on these discs, it'll show a little arrow stating the way it's supposed to rotate forward. And usually what I like to do is I'll match the same pattern direction as the new one. Once you have all these snug down, you want to do a opposite direction tighten, just to make sure that the rotor is properly seated on the actual wheel. So snug it down, move across it, snug it down, move across it. Kind of like a star pattern, kind of like what you would do with regular tires. This gives you a better even pressure to the rim. Alright, we're now ready to install the completed wheel and disc assembly to the front DualShock fork. Make sure you place your locking washers onto the new holes that are provided on the DualShock fork. This keeps, it's like a safety mechanism so your front wheel doesn't fall off in case if these nuts actually come loose. Make sure these are nice and tight. do a free spin, check the wheel, make sure it's not bent and anything obstructing it. Everything seems to be good in this case. Next thing to do is install your original caliper that it came with. You want to go ahead and inspect it and make sure there's, it's not damaged. If so, we offer calipers at jbbikeparts.com. You want to go ahead and loosen up this back nut here. Just a tab. Put it into the new disc. There you go. Use your existing hex bolts that came with your original bike. Loosen the adjustments of the placement of the caliper to the caliper bracket. Make sure it's loose and make sure it free spins. And you can start adjusting, start tightening down the main caliper bracket to the fork. Once you hear no rubbing, these are semi-adjusted. So once you have your caliper semi-snug in there, you can go in here. And there is a provided washer that's welded onto the drift shock fork. Just it serves as a guide for the cable not to be flopping around when you're riding it. Once you ride through here, you reroute it to the original position. Bring it in through here. Place it back into the caliper arm. And you can go ahead and start snuggling it down. We'll test out the brakes. It still needs some adjustments. Alright, so the next thing to do is usually it gets exposed and it'll start fraying the wire. Sometimes we'll provide these little wire butt connectors. So with time, as far as maintenance is concerned, I would just go ahead and keep these shafts lubricated, maybe with some WD-40 or some, cooking oil or something. Just keep some of the debris off the rubber O-rings. Also, you also want to make sure that the adjustment on the upper and lower bearings haven't moved. If they've moved, you can get a flathead screwdriver or something, and then you can pop it. Get a little tighter again, and as long as you don't have any excessive play going down the road, you'll hit bump bump bump. But other than that, this concludes the installation of the dual shock fork.